Hello, everyone. This is Gary Price, and it's time once again for another interview in our Open Access interview series. Today, I'm going to be speaking with Rick Anderson, who is the Associate Dean for Collections and Scholarly Communications at the Marriott Library at the University of Utah. Hi, Rick. How you doing?
Good. How are you, Gary?
Great. Before we go further, can you tell our audience a little bit more about yourself, your background, and how you ended up at the University of Utah?
Yeah, you bet. So I graduated from Brigham Young University back in 1993 with my master's in library and information science. I then went to work for YBP back when it was still called Yankee Book Peddler. I worked as a bibliographer for them for several years before going down to the University of North Carolina at Greensboro as the head acquisitions librarian. And I went from there to the University of Nevada, Reno. I was in a couple of different positions there. When I left, I was the director of resource acquisition. And I've been working here at the University of Utah since 2007.
And I believe you are also a library journal mover and shaker, and you write for Against the Grain. Is that still accurate?
Yeah, I was a mover and shaker back in 2005. I've been writing an occasional column for Against the Grain for a long time now. I'm not even sure how long it's been.
When did your awareness of open access begin? And when did you see, or is there a need for open access in today's academic publishing world?
Yeah, I've been aware of open access for, gosh, I don't know, probably 15 or so years, and thinking about and commenting on it. I do think there's a need for open access. I think that different open access programs and models and platforms meet a variety of important needs. I think that like any dissemination or publishing access or program or model, the various open access models have both costs and benefits, and so discussing those costs and benefits has been a big part of my has been something that I've been concerned with for quite some time.
Could you talk a little bit about open access at the University of Utah? What are some of the things that you're doing? Awareness by faculty and students, that type of thing?
Yeah. I think we are probably pretty typical of medium to large research institutions in that there is a pretty wide variety of opinion. There's a pretty broad spectrum of awareness among our faculty. Some of them are aware of open access and are very concerned about it. Some don't seem to be very aware, and when made aware, they don't seem to care very much. And again, I think that's true just about anywhere. A few years ago, we did try to introduce an open access policy on campus, and that really went nowhere because really the faculty didn't want to go the direction of a campus-wide policy. On the other hand, we have successfully established an institutional repository. We publish several open access journals out of our repository, and we've conducted a number of experiments with different kinds of open access archiving, from conference posters to a recent project we did with Oxford University Press, in which we're hosting the online version of a very important book that they've just published on the history of the ethics of suicide.
Could you talk about more specifics about what you're doing with Oxford University Press and how the relationship became one that actually produced something that is very important and very useful?
Yeah, it's a really great story, actually. Several years ago, our wonderful scholarly communication and copyright librarian, Allison Maurer, was having a conversation with a faculty member whose name is Peggy Batten, and she was working on this book and actually had been working on it for, gosh, I want to say something like 20 years. She had she had a contract with Oxford University Press to deliver this book. She was running behind on her deadline, which, as we know, is a very common thing among authors of scholarly monographs. But more importantly, her manuscript had grown as she worked on it way beyond the point where Oxford University Press was going to be willing or able to publish the entire manuscript. It would have required 2 volumes, and very few scholarly publishers are in the game of publishing 2-volume scholarly monographs anymore for obvious reasons. And so as Peggy and Allison were talking about this, Allison said, well, you know, what if we were to host, we, the library, were to host the full text of the complete manuscript online, and Oxford were to publish a redacted version in print and sell that while we make the full manuscript version available online for free. And Peggy thought that was a really interesting idea, and so the 3 of them went to Peggy's editor at Oxford University Press, and this started a conversation that culminated in fact, the release of Peggy's book on the history of the ethics of suicide, which is really a source book. It gathers writings going back 3,000 years that reflect how different cultures and different schools of thought around the world have dealt with not just the concept of suicide, but the rights and wrongs of suicide. When is it appropriate, and how should society either discourage or support those who choose to end their lives? And all of these really, really interesting and really very important questions. And the end result of that long process is that the book now exists in a free online version that's hosted on a blog platform where people can comment and people can actually submit new entries to the book. So the book it takes kind of an encyclopedia form, and if somebody sees a gap in the coverage of the book, they can submit to us an entry that they think ought to be added, and of course it'll go through the normal editorial review. But what that means is that the online version of the book is not only freely available to anybody who wants to read it, it's also a living document that is constantly growing. Another really cool feature of the another cool linkage between the online version and the print version is that if you buy a copy of the print version, you'll see that at the head of every chapter is a QR code, and if you click on that QR code, it takes you to the relevant chapter online where you can see expanded coverage of that topic.
This project and this resource that you're providing touches on so many different issues, let alone the importance of the material itself, but also the relationship and the open access movement, the relationship with a large publisher. Could you talk a little bit more on what each side wanted when you were negotiating? Can this be made public? What were perhaps some of the stumbling blocks? And before you get to that, are there any other projects like this in the works at the University of Utah, and perhaps you've heard of others?
Certainly there have been many examples in the past of books having companion websites.
Right.
And there have been examples in the past of books being published online in versions that include sort of value-added features like links to videos and things like that. I would not claim that this is a completely unique project. I do think that it's pioneering in a number of ways, one of the most important being that it represents an explicit collaboration and partnership between a research library and a major university press.
Right.
As far as the details of the negotiations that went on, I wish I could comment more on that. I was not actually party to the negotiations. Allison reports to me, but she carried out those negotiations and did all of the tremendous amount of work that those required on her own. I can tell you that, of course, one of the things that Oxford is concerned about, and one of the reasons I think that Oxford and I can't speak for Oxford. This is my assumption, informed by some conversations. But I think that it's clear that one of the things they want to see is whether a project like this is fiscally sustainable for them. Will the online version, by its easy discoverability and attractiveness, tend to lead people to buy a print copy of the book? Will the online version undermine sales of the print? Will it have no effect? It's still early days because this book just came out in fall of 2015.
Right.
But those are the kinds of things that I know Oxford is keeping a very close eye on. And of course, we're very interested as well to see what kind of so when you do a project like this, you always have to think about the intended consequences and the unintended consequences, right? And some of the intended consequences are very clear and are in our control. So we can make the content of this book freely available. That is an intended consequence, and whether it happens or not is up to us. There are also the unintended consequences. What happens with sales? What happens with what effect does this have on the larger worldwide community that is talking and thinking about issues around suicide and issues around moral philosophy? We have no idea what those impacts are going to be, and that's part of what makes this project fun, is that we get to start this ball rolling and then see what happens.
And what's also interesting is that it began just with a simple conversation between your colleague and the author. So it really was the author going to the publisher saying, the University of Utah Library has made this comment to me. Is there something we can do about it? So it's getting three different groups of people, if you like: the library, the author of the manuscript, and the publisher, all working together, and more importantly, all talking together.
Right.
At least get it going. You talked about
no matter what happens with the project itself in the long run.
Right.
To me, this is a huge example of the importance of librarian engagement with faculty,
right,
and of open dialogue between librarians, faculty, and scholarly publishers.
It's politely speaking to others and getting the word out there that the library is more than just what a lot of people have stereotyped as about what a library is and what it's about. You talked about discoverability. What are things, in your view, that libraries could do to make open access more discoverable? Because there's so many different places to get to the same thing. And one thing that I'm seeing, perhaps you are too, is I'm seeing various versions of articles flying around all over the place. Do you think that the difference between the final version and the open access version that somebody might put up on Archive or one of many other sites, does that make a difference to the, let's say, to the undergraduate student who just wants something and they discover it via Google?
I think it matters. It matters differently. There are so many different variables, right, in every situation. So it depends on who the reader is. It depends on why the person is looking at the article, and I think it depends very much on what kind of article it is. And it depends on which version it is that we're talking about. So in some disciplines, for some readers with some particular articles, the author's final manuscript is going to be absolutely fine. And in some disciplines, for some readers, if they don't have access to the version of record, then for all intents and purposes, they don't have access. And I think it's important that we not talk about this issue as if one answer is always going to be the right answer in every situation for every reader, because clearly that's not the case.
Do you see the version of record changing over time, meaning we're seeing more and more with altmetrics? Does it always will it always be the final print bound version? I mean, so that's almost an intro to what are your feelings about altmetrics to start with. I know you led the debate on the topic at the Charleston conference.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting topic. My personal feeling is the more different ways we have of measuring things, I think the more likely it is that we're going to end up triangulating on an actually valid measurement. There's the idea that measuring citations is the one true way to measure the impact of an article. I think that I'm not sure there's anybody who believes that now. So then that begs the question, well, what other things should we measure? And of course, that's a very lively debate. I don't pretend to be smart enough to be able to offer a final answer to that, but I welcome the proliferation of new ideas about how we might measure the impact of articles.
One other thing that I see in my work is the difference in quality of metadata with open access materials. Sometimes it's thorough and excellent, other times there's barely anything there. Do you see the need in the future to develop some sort of standard that hopefully more and more organizations would follow? What can we do? Because this also obviously goes back to discoverability. And with better metadata, would hopefully make things more discoverable, especially when you're trying to pull it out of a large discovery layer or other large database.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I think it begs a deeper one, which is why would we, or not, maybe not a deeper one, but a prior one, which is why would we assume that open access materials need metadata that is any less rigorous than the metadata we would apply to something that we bought access to?
Right.
So if we were to agree that everything deserves really good metadata, then the next question we have to deal with is the question of the tension between what we need and what we have the resources to provide. Right. I think that one of the big reasons that we see such huge variability in metadata quality among open and toll access things is that the number of things that are freely available is enormous. The number of things that in my library, the number of things that we provide for which we have paid is much, much smaller. And just sort of intuitively, we have a tendency to say, well, we need to focus on making sure that people have access to the stuff that we've paid for. The stuff that we haven't paid for access to, yes, we want to make that discoverable, but that has to take second place given the smallness of our metadata creation staff and the number of things that we've paid for that we need to provide access to. And I think that that mindset is practically universal among libraries. And to me, it's not surprising at all that there's so little really good metadata for open access materials, because there are so many things that are available for free, and some of them we would technically say are open access and some of them aren't. But the number of things that are freely available is huge and constantly growing, and the number of people that we have available to assign metadata is small and staying the same.
I'd like to go back to something we talked about in the beginning in the question about awareness. Can you talk specifically about students at your university and your past experience? You know, the students today are the faculty of tomorrow, and so it goes. What is could you talk a little bit more about their awareness of open access and the need for it? Or, again, like some of your faculty, you know, it's interesting, but it's not something they're going to focus too much on.
Yeah, my impression, and of course this is a subjective impression, but my impression is that students as a whole are not aware of open access as an issue. What they tend to be very aware of is what they are able to get access to and what they are not. And they tend to experience the things that we have licensed and that are available to them for that reason as being in the same category as things that are available to them simply because they're freely available online. They have a very limited, they recognize to a very limited degree the difference between access to things that we've bought for them and access to things that they could get whether they were at the University of Utah or not. To the degree that that's true, they are just not really thinking in terms of open access. There's just stuff they can get and stuff they can't. I think that one of the things that militates against students having any kind of real understanding of what open access is, among those things is the ongoing controversy and unsettled nature of the definition of open access itself. I mean, those of us who work all day, every day in a field where open access is a constant issue, we can't agree among ourselves about what we mean by open access. As long as that's the case, our students have no hope of knowing what open access is, because they're not going to be getting any kind of consistent definition from the ones that they turn to for information. Another thing that makes it harder, I think, for students to understand what open access is the fact that in the media we have, and we've seen examples of this just in recent days, media or journalists who themselves have no understanding at all of the issues or of what open access is, writing in newspapers of record on topics related to open access, and then we have millions of people reading those articles and going, "Oh, so that's what's going on with open access," and that just contributes to the confusion and the misunderstanding. So, as far as really understanding and being aware of open access issues, I'm in a little bit of despair about that when it comes to our students and even our faculty. It's such a complicated issue. And there are so many people who have so much invested in making it seem simple, and we also have an awful lot of people who are influential who are just sort of saying off the cuff stupid things that I don't know how long it's going to be before we have any kind of real clarity or real understanding in the general public about the issues surrounding open access.
Do you think that students and faculty members need to have this knowledge? Should this knowledge be something that's taught before they get to the University of Utah or the University of whatever?
That's a really good question. There was a time when I might have said, it doesn't matter so much whether faculty and students all understand and agree on what open access means. What matters is that we make as much really good content. What matters is that we make the content that they need access to in order to do their work available to them with as little friction as possible.
Before we conclude here, I wanted to give you a moment or two to take a look into your crystal ball, share some of the things that you might see coming next, or things you'd like to see moving forward the next 2 to 5 years.
I would really like to see more and stronger voices of analysis as we consider new programs and initiatives around open access. This isn't to say that I would want to see the voices of advocacy in any way, quashed or lessened. I just would like, as they continue to do what they should do, which is advocate, I would also like to see more voices of analysis coming up and saying, okay, we're talking about this particular initiative, let's look at the benefits and let's look at the costs and compare them to each other and make some rational decisions about how to move forward. That's something I would like to see. As far as what we are going to see, I think that we are going to see more and more APC-based gold open access. We're certainly going to see that continuing to grow in the UK, where the higher education establishment has basically explicitly said, yeah, APC-based gold open access is our direction forward. We are not going to see that in the US, I don't believe, because we don't have a centralized higher education establishment. We have 50 higher education public higher education establishments that are all competing with each other for the best professors. So that leads to a completely different dynamic in the US, which I think is going to be very, very interesting to watch over the next 2 to 5 years. In the US, we're going to see more growth in green open access, but I think that growth is going to continue to be relatively slow. Unless funding agencies are able to impose green open access solutions on a significant number of researchers, and there does seem to be some movement in that direction.